The denture is out of the pressure pot. So as soon as you take it out of the pressure pot, sorry, I went out of camera. It's the thing I love about demos. All of a sudden something doesn't work and you're like, oh, what the heck? There we are. Okay. As soon as you take it out of the pressure pot, take the denture off the model. It's going to be much easier and much less damaging to the model to do it now than to do it later. When you do it with a knife that has a fairly substantial blade. Use your big plaster knife. Don't try and do it with a knife like this. Don't try and do it with your Zale. All you'll end up doing is bending your knife and wrecking your knife, and you're also digging into the model and the denture in just a very small area, so you're going to end up just damaging the model more and possibly damaging the denture more. You need something with a fairly large blade, and put the blade in at the posterior quadrant, and then just give it gentle, well, not really gentle, but small, just small twists. The acrylic is flexible, and you can gradually work it off the model. Now remember that your clasps are held on by the matrices that you made earlier. So releasing those matrices is a good idea. You don't want to just force it too much all at once, because you'll end up bending your clasps or breaking something more than you need to. The teeth are going to break. There's not much you can do about breaking the teeth, but you don't need to. You don't want to bend the clasps all to heck or break the flange or anything else. And this is why we have a duplicate model. This is going to allow us. No, I'm not going to stab my hand. The duplicate model is going to allow us to fit this denture back onto the duplicate. Just pop off my matrices here. I should. Pop off fairly easily. And there's the denture. So I'm going to trim this. I'm going to trim this just the way that we trimmed our previous denture or your Holly retainer. Just remember to watch the clasps. Don't hit the clasps. Now, let's just trim this. Where's my... Let me move the camera. Handpiece off the desk. Trim this up quickly. Gonna reduce the flash around the flange a little bit. I'm going to be careful not to hit that clasp. Going to trim the pallet to where I put my scribe line. I'm going to make this palatal border of the denture flat right now. I want to end up with a 1 to 2 millimeter thick flat border there. Scallop the Now that I have clasps on this one, I'm going to leave a little more acrylic on the lingual of the teeth that have clasps. I'm using just the corner of the burr to scallop all of the teeth. Make sure while you do this that you're not hitting the denture over on the other side with this big stone. Adjust the thickness of the acrylic a little bit. You've got clasps in here, so you're going to leave it a little bit thicker. How thick is going to be defined by where you put your clasp, how far your clasps were off the tissue. Because your absolute minimum thickness can be about 3 millimeters. A millimeter of acrylic under the tissue, about a millimeter of thickness for the clasp wire, and a millimeter over the clasp wire. That's the absolute minimum that you can have for the thickness of the clasp. Or sorry, the thickness of the acrylic. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this entire thing, and then after I've trimmed the entire partial, then I'm going to fit it to the model. I'm not going to try and fit it to the model until I've got it in the shape that, or the approximate shape that it should be. Now I'm not going to make it super thin, and especially not in the areas that I know I may have to adjust. But the areas that I may have to adjust are just the areas around the teeth, and particularly the areas at the proximal of the edentulous saddle. So with the big burr here, I'm just smoothing and shaping a bit. And I'm going to find a sandpaper disc. Okay. One of my favorite tools, especially for trimming just about anything, but especially for trimming partials, is this sandpaper disc. The sandpaper disc, sandpaper on one side, paper on the other, and paper at the edge. So it trims really well on this side. It trims a bit on the edge, trims almost nothing on this side. So that lets you come in to places like right close to this wire, and the paper side of the disc is to the wire. So I can trim right up to that with doing very little damage to the wire. Whereas most of our trimming implements would have damaged that wire as I got close to it or as I touched it. So I'm just going to do this very simply. I'm basically making the sides of that saddle fairly straight. Now, one of the things that are going to be different about this one is that we have this flange out here, and this flange has undercuts there. We also have undercuts back along here. We have undercuts on the proximal of the flange there. Now, I blocked this out, so my blockout wax is there. So my blockout wax is in these areas also. Now really I should have gone and boiled this off first, but I didn't put a lot of block out, so I just went ahead and started trimming. Scalpel. I'm going to use a scalpel just to cut any little pieces of acrylic that are around the clasp wires. Students at first always get really concerned about how sharp the acrylic is in the interdental spaces here. So these bits of acrylic here and here and here, oh, these are really, really sharp. Isn't that going to hurt the patient? They're only sharp when you're holding them in your hand like this. When they're in the patient's mouth, those are in between the teeth and they blend with the teeth. So no, they're not sharp when they're in the patient's mouth. For seating the partial onto the model now, we're going to put on the model. We're going to make sure that the model has no flaws. Make sure that there's no areas that this model is vastly different from your other one. If it's a duplicate model, it should be very accurate. Ideally, you've poured yours from the same puck, so they should be pretty accurate. These two that I have here are quite different. There's a lot of distortion on this one, so I'm not expecting this to fit particularly well or particularly easily. So you're going to place it onto the denture onto your model, and you want to gently push, and you'll find pretty quickly it's probably going to stop. So what we need to do is we need to see why it's stopping. There's got to be a place where the denture is running into the model and it's stopping the denture from seating anymore. So take a look, and if you have a pencil, take a look with a pencil. Look and see where the model is touching, especially the teeth. So it's touching the mesial of that 4 right there, and it's touching the distal of the 3 there, and it's touching the soft tissue here where we have an undercut in the soft tissue. So I'm just going to look for these places where the model is running into the denture, and that's where the undercuts are that's interfering with this going on to the model. I'm going to take a fairly fine burr. You don't want to use a great big burr to do this. And I'm going to do just a little bit of reduction. I'm going to look at the acrylic and see if I can see where the acrylic is sticking out. I've got the marks I made to tell me where the interference is, so I can look at the acrylic and I can see that there's a little bulk of acrylic right there. And that's where it's running into the undercut. Now here on the edge of the flange, you can see that this is quite sharp right now because we've just trimmed it, and it's hooking this way because there's an undercut in the tissue. The flange is hooking in, and that's getting caught. So we've got a couple of options. The first option is you can just make the flange shorter. Okay, shortening a flange to reduce the undercut is a really good way to get rid of the interference. But I can also come into the intaglio and just take away that little hook a little bit where it's hooking into the undercut. Now I put it back on the model, and I'm going to push firmly, but I'm not going to push really, really hard. I'm going to push until, well, I'm going to push until, in this case, it seats. Okay. Now I did have, as I said, this model has discrepancies. It's a little different from the other model, so this clasp doesn't want to fit. But otherwise, it went on pretty well. So with a little bit of block out and then a little bit of adjustment, you can get these to fit onto the model pretty well. This is sitting high, like this is sitting high in the model, so it's hanging down in the mouth right now. Or right now, if it was like this in the mouth, that would be hanging down. Again, this model doesn't match my original model, but in terms, one of the most surprising things that I learned when I became a clinician is in the laboratory. When I learned how to do these in the laboratory, we had to very carefully adjust these partials until they seated perfectly on the model and they just slid into place, and there was no particular force. We didn't have to push it hard. It didn't break any teeth. I just snapped a tooth there trying to take this off. And that's how we learned to do it. That's how I learned to do a partial in the lab, was that you put it on and you had no interference and it just slid onto the model. And when I started putting these in patients' mouths, the thing that absolutely flabbergasted me was that if I made a partial like that fit the patient like that on the model, when I put it in the patient's mouth, it had no retention whatsoever, and it just fell right out of the patient's mouth. And I realized that this dry stone model has a heck of a lot more friction than the smooth enamel of the teeth, the lubrication provided by the saliva, the elasticity and resilience provided by the tissue rather than the hard stone. And so we were always fighting to get this to fit perfectly without any stress or force on the model, but in the mouth that didn't work. So as a clinician, I would always make as I trimmed my dentures, I just got used to trimming them the way that I saw it, and sometimes I didn't even put it on if it was a small denture, I wouldn't even put it on the model. And you learn pretty quickly to be able to look and see where the undercuts are. And in any case, I'm not going to drag this out too long. My big observation was that when it fits really nicely on the model, it's probably going to be too loose in the mouth. So if it's tight on your model, that's probably okay. All right. So there's my bit of heresy for today. Now this is this can be cleaned up some more. I can clean up the flange. I can smooth this some more. There's a couple of undercuts over here. So one of the things you can look for when you're trying to figure out where it's interfering with the model, you'll see where the model starts to scrape off onto the acrylic in these white areas right there and right there. So let me get closer so you can see them. This should focus. There we are. So right there and right there in the interproximal embrasure, the stone has scraped onto the acrylic and it's left a white mark on the acrylic, that tells me that there's an undercut there that's interfering. So if I'm trying to put this on and it's not going on, that's one of the things that I'm going to look for. I'm going to look at the denture and I'm going to see where on the denture I've got white spots of stone dust. And I've got it there, there's a little bit there, over here on the tooth. So this would be the distal of the 1-1. There's a little bit of dust right there. So that's probably scraping there. We've got some dust in this area, a little bit along the gingival margin there. Most of the time you're going to find it around the interdental embrasure, like that. So one of the things you can look for as you're trying to fit a partial, look for where the model has left marks, has left white dust on the denture. The other thing that you can do is look at the model. So I'm going to try and focus on the model here. Hopefully it's going to focus. So if you look at the model where that white dust was left on the denture, right there, you can see a scrape on the model. Okay? And over here, where the white dust was left on the denture, you can see that the model is scraped. And that tooth broke off. There's a little scrape along the gingival margin right there, where there was a scrape on the central, and on the tissue here. Right there. You can see where there's a little flat area right there, where the denture scraped into the model. So when you're trying to fit the denture to the model and it's not fitting, push it. Give it a firm push, but not a huge, like, no, don't Arnold Schwarzenegger it. Just give it a push until it stops, and then take it off and look at the model and look at the denture and find the places where they were touching. The white dust on the model and the scrape marks on the denture. Fitting an acrylic denture to the model is one of the toughest. I think it's one of the toughest things that you can do in the lab. But you get used to it. You get used to looking for the undercut and finding the undercut. When you polish this, it's exactly the same as the polishing that you've done previously. You just want to make sure that you don't catch these clasps in the buffs. A lot of times what you can do is similar to what you did in ortho. If you're polishing near the clasp, just cover the clasp with your fingers. Just lightly, like that, to make sure that the buff doesn't catch it, or make sure that you're polishing in a direction which is away from the clasp. So this, we can go ahead and polish this up, and you guys can trim and polish yours, and this will be due at the end of class on Friday. Okay, good luck, have fun.